The first note finds her like a thread of light slipping under a locked door. Emily stops mid-step in the city square, breath caught, eyes wide, the world tilting as a rusty violin spills a trembling ribbon of sound. Pigeons lift, a bus exhales, somewhere a bell rings, and through it all the thin melody wavers, impossibly clear. She has never heard a thing in her life, not the thud of her own heartbeat, not her father's name on his lips. Yet here it is, a tone that quivers against her ribs like warm glass. The boy who plays is barefoot, bow patched with tape, chin pressed to scuffed wood. He doesn't look at her. He's playing for the sky, for the pigeons, for the hunger that gnaws his belly. Each stroke scratches and sings, a river over stones, a moth against a window. Emily sways toward him, palms open, as if the sound were a creature that might spook and flee. Tears streak hot. She mouths a word she has only ever seen. Music. If you can hear me, her eyes seem to say to the crowd, then hear this with me. And if you're watching now, take a second, subscribe, like, join us in this moment. Because what's happening is the kind of miracle we forget to expect. Tell me in the comments, what's the first sound you would want to hear if you'd lived your whole life in silence? The square had always been her secret place, even when it gave her nothing back. She memorized the choreography of traffic lights, the pulse of feet through concrete, the shimmer of laughter on faces. She learned the city by the way it moved, the way it breathed. Music, for her, was just a picture. A mouth shaping a note, a hand lifting a bow, the shared exhale of strangers. She came here to feel close to something she couldn't name. At home, the walls were soft with money and muffled with worry. Her father's shoes made no sound on the rugs. The staff learned to speak with eyes and hands. Doctors had pressed cool instruments to Emily's temples, mapped her with gentle sorrow, and written conclusions in neat, apologetic lines. Profound, permanent. The words flashed on her father's phone, then folded into his spine like extra weight. He became the kind of man who tried to buy silence a cure, tutors, therapists, devices that blinked like little lighthouses behind her ears. "We won't give up," his mouth formed, and she read it faithfully, even when his shoulders argued otherwise. He measured hope in invoices and sleepless nights, and when both ran high, he hid behind meetings, glass, and a view of the city he owned but didn't know. Emily learned to read the weather of people. The nurse with lavender lotion and quick jokes, the driver who hummed, she could see it in his throat, the gardener who spoke to roses as if they were shy children. She collected kindness the way other kids collected songs. At the end of each day, she set them on her windowsill, like seashells, and listened with her hands, the only way she knew. One afternoon, she found the square by following a kite, a yellow one, tugging at its string like a stubborn son. The boy running it laughed, and though she couldn't hear, she felt the laugh ripple the air. After that, the square became a map of rituals. The popcorn vendor who salted the wind, the painter who made buildings bloom on canvas, the old couple who slow danced in sneakers to a rhythm only they could remember. And always, the musicians. She felt them before she saw them, through the soles of her shoes and the railings of benches. Drums were thunder in bone. Guitars trembled like a cat purring against her wrist. Violins were only pictures and wind, a bow soaring the quiet into prettier pieces. She watched, faithful and far away, part of a congregation gathered around a god she could not touch. On the morning the miracle opened, the sky was the color of old postcards. Emily slipped from the town car with a scarf like a small flag at her throat and drifted toward the fountain's silver spray. Her father took a call, lips thin with news she couldn't pass, and waved her back without looking. She turned instead, pulled by a thread she didn't know was there, toward a boy she did not yet know she needed. Daniel had tuned the violin by feel, the way his mother taught him. "Listen with your fingertips," she'd said, "and your pulse. He tightened a peg until the string sang against his skin, then loosened it until it sighed. The instrument was a survivor, cracks like lightning held closed by resin, a varnish rubbed dull by prayers. He played for coins, sure, but mostly he played for the ache to lean on something that didn't break. When bow met string, the sound crawled out rusty and tender. It wasn't pretty in the way a stage would require, but it was honest, a kind of bravery shaped into noise. It climbed the air, wobbled, caught, and rose. Emily felt the first vibration lick her wrists. She tilted her head. The second found the hollow of her throat. The third arrived as if from inside her, a small bird shaking off sleep. Her body remembered the language before her mind did. The skin on her forearms pebbled, her knees unlocked, her mouth softened into an O. Noise said something ancient in her, the way a newborn recognizes milk. Noise, and then sound. The difference was a door, and it swung inward with a sigh she swore she could hear. She took a step, and the city rearranged itself around her. Tires hissed like whispered gossip. A child's squeal skated up a scale. Coins pinged in the violin case, bright as rain on tin. People's voices braided and unbraided, colors she could finally taste. She pressed her palms to her ears, then pulled them away, frightened to touch the spell. The music dipped, the bow stuttered, and still it stayed. Across the square, Richard's call died mid-sentence. He saw his daughter as if seeing her anew, not the careful girl he'd guarded, but a flame catching wind. Panic flashed first. Danger, crowd, control, then something else, something softer that made his chest feel too small. He started toward her, each step a negotiation with a world that suddenly failed to obey the rules he'd written. Emily reached the boy. His hair was a tangle of night. His eyes, when they lifted, were wary and bright. She didn't sign. She didn't write. She touched the violin's with fingers that shook, and with her other hand touched her own ear, then her heart, then him. The boy blinked, lifted the bow, and answered in the only language he had. He played. The melody changed shape under his hands. A question turned lullaby, turned open road. It rose and fell like breathing, like the sea video she'd watched with captions turned on. Emily laughed, sharp, startled, undeniably audible to herself. A gull cried overhead, and the note sliced the sky, and she gasped again because the world had been holding a conversation without her, and now it wanted to catch her up all at once. Around them, strangers slowed, then stopped, then gathered. The square became a bowl for sound, and they were the light spilling in. Emily's tears came fast, warm, salt she could hear when they hit her lips. The bow's rasp was a rough hand made gentle. The violin's tremor painted gold along the bones of her face. Everything was too much and exactly right. She didn't notice the cameras, the lifted phones, the way attention angled like sunlight through glass. She only knew the corridor between them, the boy, the wood, the string, the air, and her. She stood in the center of that corridor, finally a person, where before she had been a ghost. The note hung, thinned, and held, a wire stretched from his hands to her ribs. And then a thought arrived, quiet and terrifying. If this is the first note, what was the first silence? What debt did she owe to the years of quiet that had taught her to listen with everything but her ears? She felt the answer coil somewhere deep, a story asking to be told, a beginning begging for a before. She looked up at the boy, at her father closing the distance, at the city leaning in, and knew the past was about to speak. Emily's story did not begin with music. It began with silence so complete that even her own cries went unnoticed by her. When she was born, the doctors leaned close with their instruments, frowning as they whispered to her father words he refused to believe. She slept through slamming doors and thunder, through lullabies her mother sang into the air like unanswered prayers. Silence became her cradle, her inheritance, and her prison. As she grew, the truth became harder to deny. Her toys clattered to the floor without stirring her. Dogs barked at the gate, and she turned her head only when she saw their teeth. Richard, her father, carried her from clinic to clinic, clinging to the thin hope that one day a specialist would prove everyone else wrong. But every room ended the same way, with papers stamped, "profound hearing loss." Richard's wealth could buy machines, tutors, and surgeries, but not the thing he longed for most, a world where his daughter could hear him say her name. He hired the best therapists, installed devices that blinked and buzzed, and studied every article that promised breakthroughs. Yet each time Emily failed to respond, his jaw hardened, his heart folding into silence to match hers. Behind his sternness lived a man, mourning the sound of his child's laughter. Emily, meanwhile, built her own language. She traced words with her fingers, read lips with careful patience, and learned to stitch meaning from gestures. Her mother, before illness took her, spent long evenings teaching Emily how to smile without sound, and how to ask questions with her eyes. It was love without music, a bond made of touch and presence, strong but incomplete. Emily always wondered what her mother's voice might have felt like. By the time she was 7, silence was both her companion and her enemy. At school, she watched other children sing, clap, and chatter, their joy skipping past her like stones across water. Teachers tried to include her, but their pity sat heavy. And Emily felt more like a spectator than a participant. Her notebooks filled with sketches of birds, violins, and mouths open wide in song, creatures of a world forever out of reach. At home, Richard built walls of protection as high as the mansion's gates. He dismissed parties, gatherings, and visitors, insisting it was for Emily's comfort. But Emily saw the truth. He feared her vulnerability more than she did. His love came, wrapped in control, in the unspoken belief that silence made her fragile. She longed for freedom, for the chance to be more than the girl who lived inside muted halls. The city, when glimpsed through tinted car windows, fascinated her. Street vendors leaned over steaming carts, their lips shaping jokes. Musicians stamped and swayed, their movements hinting at rhythms Emily could only imagine. She memorized everything, the sparkle of tambourines, the arcs of violin bows, the sway of hips to unheard melodies. In those brief flashes, she dreamed of stepping out into a life that vibrated with more than just touch. At night, she pressed her ear to the floorboards, hoping the earth might carry her a message. Sometimes she felt faint rumbles, the hum of a distant truck, the footsteps of servants, the thunder rolling far away. Those vibrations comforted her, a reminder that something existed beyond the quiet. She imagined that if she listened hard enough, one day the floor would whisper the secrets of the world she was missing. Richard, watching from the doorway, carried his own secret. He wanted to protect Emily from the ache of knowing what she lacked. Yet his fear often built the very walls that deepened her loneliness. In his office, late at night, he would pore over medical journals and clench his fists, a man at war with fate. There must be a way. His lips formed, but the silence of her empty room was the only answer. And so Emily grew, not broken but waiting for something she couldn't name. She painted her dreams with color, walked through her days in stillness, and kept her heart open for a miracle she never dared expect. What she didn't know was that beyond the mansion gates, in the corners of the city her father despised, fate had already set her path toward a boy with a violin and a story as unfinished as hers. Richard Thornton was a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and headlines, a figure who bent markets with a signature. He thrived in a world of control, precision, and authority, but there was one place his power failed him: His daughter. No empire could buy back the sound she had never known. This truth gnawed at him daily, reshaping his love into something sharp, protective, and often suffocating. To shield Emily from disappointment, Richard constructed a life of velvet and glass. Tutors came to the mansion instead of classrooms, doctors instead of playmates, therapists instead of friends. The gates were more than iron. They were walls against chaos, against pity, against the reminder that outside lived a world she could not fully join. Richard convinced himself this was kindness, though deep down he knew it was fear. Emily felt the bars of this golden cage even as a child. She pressed her nose against the limousine window, fascinated by passing parks where children shouted games she could only guess at. When she waved, they rarely noticed her, too caught up in their noisy joy. Her heart swelled with both envy and yearning, a silent plea for something more than careful footsteps on soundless rugs. By the time she turned 15, her longing was harder to contain. She found ways to sneak from the mansion, slipping past staff who pitied her too much to stop her. The city, raw and unfiltered, welcomed her with flashing lights and crowded sidewalks. She couldn't hear the laughter, the horns, the songs, but she felt them pressing around her, a tidal wave of life that made her pulse quicken. The square became her secret sanctuary. Here, surrounded by street performers and vendors, she felt closest to what she imagined sound must be like. She watched a guitarist pluck strings with fervor, saw the vibrations ripple through his arms. She saw drummers' bodies move like thunder, their sticks blurring in the air. Most of all, she watched the violinists, mesmerized by the bow's dance across taut strings, a dance she longed to join. Yet her father's shadow loomed everywhere. Richard believed the city was dangerous, filled with germs, thieves, and reminders of everything Emily lacked. When he discovered her first escape, his anger was swift, but his fear was greater. "You don't understand the risks." His lips formed, his hands trembling though he tried to hide it. Emily lowered her gaze, but inside, her rebellion began to bloom. Still, she could not blame him entirely. She knew his love was real, if misguided. She had seen him fall asleep at his desk, medical books open under his cheek. She had caught him watching her from doorways, sorrow shadowing his face when he thought she wasn't looking. His heart was a battlefield, love against helplessness, and Emily was both the reason he fought and the reason he felt defeated. But the mansion walls could not keep out her curiosity forever. The rhythms of the square tugged at her like a magnet, each visit carving deeper into her soul. She began to dream of the musicians, even in her sleep, their bows and strings painting silent symphonies in her mind. Something inside her whispered that if she stayed in silence forever, she would wither. She needed more. Richard, meanwhile, tightened his grip. He filled her schedule with lessons and obligations, trying to keep her too busy to slip away. But he underestimated the power of a teenager's hunger for freedom, especially one who had been denied it her whole life. Emily's secret journeys only grew bolder, each step outside her mansion a small rebellion, each glimpse of the square a promise she clung to. And somewhere, in the same city he tried to keep her from, a boy named Daniel lifted a battered violin to his chin. His bow scraped and sang, and though the sound never reached Emily's ears, fate was already threading its way between them. The weight of Richard's love, the silence of Emily's world, and the music of a boy with nothing to lose were about to collide in ways none of them could imagine. Daniel's world was carved from shadows and echoes of loss. He lived in an abandoned train station, where the walls wept with rain and the nights echoed with the groans of metal long forgotten. A thin blanket was his shield against the cold, and hunger was his constant companion. Yet among the broken glass and peeling paint, one treasure remained untouched, his mother's violin. It was cracked, rusted at the hinges and scarred from years of use, but to Daniel it was life itself. His mother had been the one to place the instrument in his hands, guiding his small fingers over the strings. "Listen with your heart," she had told him, pressing her ear to his chest. "Music lives here before it lives anywhere else." When she passed, the violin became both her memory and her blessing. Every note Daniel played was a way of speaking to her, a conversation stretched across heaven and earth. By day, Daniel wandered the streets, collecting coins by playing at busy corners. Most passers-by hurried past, their eyes sliding over him as if he were part of the pavement. A few dropped spare change, never looking closely enough to see the boy behind the bow. But Daniel kept playing, because music was the only thing that gave his life shape. Without it, the silence of abandonment would have swallowed him whole. The violin itself was a fighter. Its varnish had dulled into patches of brown and amber, its strings frayed like weary ropes. When Daniel tightened a peg, the wood creaked in protest. Yet when the bow touched, even the worn strings found a voice. The sound was raw, imperfect, and filled with a kind of aching honesty that polished instruments could never imitate. The violin told the truth of his hunger, his loneliness, and his hope. Daniel dreamed not of stages or fame, but of being heard, truly heard. He imagined someone pausing in the crowd not to pity him, not to toss a coin, but to understand the story his music carried. Sometimes he closed his eyes as he played, imagining his mother listening with her soft smile, whispering, "I hear you, my son." It was enough to keep his bow moving, even when his stomach growled and his hands shook with cold. At night, he returned to the train station, its iron beams groaning like old bones. He lit candles scavenged from bins, their flickering light dancing across the violin's scratched surface. He would play lullabies until the echoes filled the empty station, transforming the ruin into a concert hall only he could see. In those moments, he was no longer a homeless boy. He was a musician, a son, and a dreamer. The city, however, was not kind to dreamers. Police sometimes chased him from corners, barking orders he couldn't disobey. Other boys mocked his violin, calling it junk, snatching coins from his case when he wasn't looking. Daniel learned to defend his music fiercely, clutching it to his chest as if it were his own heartbeat. "As long as I have this," he whispered to himself, "I am not alone." One evening, his bow splintered at the edge, leaving a jagged crack. Panic tightened his chest. Without the bow, the violin would fall silent, and with it, the last thread connecting him to his mother. But Daniel, stubborn as always, bound the bow with string and tape. He pressed it to the violin once more, and though the sound was rougher, it still sang. Perhaps not perfectly, but perfectly enough for him. The square became his stage, even when no one clapped. Beneath lamplight, he drew music from the battered strings, letting the sound spill into the night air. Strangers came and went, but Daniel stayed, bow moving until his arms trembled. Each note was a promise to himself, that he would not be erased, that even if the world ignored him, he would keep playing until someone finally listened. And fate, patient and watchful, was already guiding his melody. Somewhere beyond the crowd, a girl named Emily was inching closer each day. She could not hear him yet, not in the way others did, but her soul was tuning itself to his music. Soon, two lives shaped by silence, one chosen, one imposed, would meet in the square, and the world would never be the same. Emily noticed him first as a figure in the corner of the square, bow moving with determination over a battered violin. She had seen countless musicians before, but something about this boy made her pause. His music seemed to ripple through the air differently, vibrating not only in the ground beneath her shoes, but in her chest, deeper than anything she had felt before. Though she could not hear the sound, she felt a strange urgency, as if the notes were meant for her alone. She inched closer, careful not to draw her father's attention. Richard was busy with his phone, his lips moving quickly as he paced. Emily's eyes never left the boy. His hair was messy, his clothes worn, yet his posture was proud. Every stroke of the bow revealed not just skill, but hunger, pain, and something fragile hidden beneath the rawness. Emily didn't know why, but her heart beat faster the longer she watched. When the boy glanced up, their eyes met. For a fleeting second, Emily felt as though he saw her, not the girl in designer clothes, not the millionaire's daughter, but someone searching for something she couldn't name. He blinked, surprised, then looked back at his violin, bow trembling as though her gaze had shaken him. Emily's breath caught. No musician had ever made her feel like this. She took a step forward, and the vibrations grew stronger. Her fingers tingled as if invisible strings were tying her to the violin. She pressed her palm to her chest, startled by the way it echoed inside her. The boy's music was different, alive in a way she had never experienced before. For the first time, she wondered if silence could be broken not by science but by something deeper. Richard's voice cut across her thoughts. His sharp gestures demanded she step back, his face tight with disapproval. He didn't even glance at the boy. He only saw the danger of appearances, the threat of a world beyond his control. Emily obeyed, though her heart twisted. Even as she turned away, her eyes clung to the violin, unwilling to let go of the connection she felt. The boy noticed her leaving. A flicker of disappointment crossed his face, but he kept playing, as if the music itself was more important than any audience. Emily's chest ached as she walked, her father's hand firm on her shoulder. She wanted to resist, to stay, but the weight of his authority pressed too heavily. Still, something inside her whispered that this was not the end. Back in the car, the city lights blurred into streaks of color outside the window. Emily touched her fingertips to the glass, imagining the vibrations of the violin still humming beneath her skin. She closed her eyes and replayed the moment their eyes had locked. The memory felt louder than anything she had ever known. For the first time, she began to believe there might be more waiting for her beyond silence. Richard sat beside her, oblivious to the storm brewing inside his daughter. He believed he had protected her, shielding her from a beggar who represented everything fragile and unsafe. But Emily wasn't thinking about safety. She was thinking about the boy's music, about how it seemed to speak directly to a place inside her she had never touched before. Something had awakened, and she couldn't push it away. That night, Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She remembered the way the violin shook in his hands, the way the bow bent under his pressure, the raw beauty that had somehow found its way to her heart. She didn't know his name, but she knew she had to see him again. The silence of her room suddenly felt heavier, unbearable compared to the strange life she had felt in the square, and so a seed was planted. In the days that followed, Emily's thoughts drifted constantly to the boy with the violin. She didn't understand it, couldn't explain it, but she knew she would return. Her father's warnings, his anger, his fear, none of it could erase what she had felt. Something had passed between her and that boy, something neither silence nor wealth could keep apart. Emily returned to the square the very next afternoon, her steps light with anticipation. She waited until her father's schedule distracted him, slipping from the mansion unnoticed. The city was alive with its usual rhythm, vendors calling, cars streaming, children darting between benches. But Emily focused only on one thing, the corner where the boy played. Her heart raced as she spotted him again, violin tucked under his chin, bow dancing across strings. This time, she sat closer, just beyond the reach of his case. Daniel, though he didn't yet know her name, noticed the quiet girl immediately. Her eyes never left him, not with pity like others, but with something sharper, hungrier. It unsettled him at first, but the longer she watched, the steadier his playing became. For the first time in weeks, he felt like his music mattered to someone. Emily learned to read him through the tilt of his shoulders, the way his eyelids pressed shut when the melody grew heavy. His music carried stories she couldn't hear but somehow understood. She saw loneliness in his bowed head, courage in the strength of his grip, longing in the way he lingered on certain notes. Without words, she began to know him. Without sound, she began to listen. Day after day, she returned. Sometimes she brought a notebook, sketching him as he played, filling pages with bows and strings, with his outline against the fountain. Daniel pretended not to notice, but curiosity tugged at him. Why did she come back? Why did she sit in silence, scribbling furiously, watching him as though each note carved itself into her soul? One evening, the question escaped him. When his song ended and the crowd scattered, Daniel leaned down and asked softly, "Do you like the music?" His voice was rough from the cold, but his eyes held genuine curiosity. Emily, startled, then opened her notebook and wrote quickly, "I cannot hear you, but I feel you." She lifted the page for him to see, her hands trembling. Daniel froze, unsure what to say. The words pierced deeper than he expected. He had longed for someone to hear him, but this girl, this stranger, offered something even more profound. She felt him. That was different, stronger, truer. A small smile tugged at his lips, and without answering, he lifted the violin again. This time, every note was for her. Emily closed her eyes, to thrum letting the vibrations roll as if the city itself leaned in to listen with her. She pressed her palm against the stone bench, against her chest, anywhere the music could travel into her. When she opened her eyes again, Daniel was watching, and in that look a silent agreement formed. They understood each other. From then on, their meetings grew into rituals. Emily would arrive quietly, sometimes hiding from her father's drivers, and Daniel would play as if the square belonged only to them. They rarely spoke, but they didn't need to. Her notebook carried simple words, "Beautiful, again, thank you," and his bow answered every page with sound. Their bond was stitched together by silence and song alike. Still, danger lingered in the background. Emily knew her father would never approve, and Daniel knew the risk of relying on someone from a world so far from his own. Yet neither of them could stop. The more time they spent together, the more their hearts leaned toward each other, drawn by a force neither wealth nor poverty could explain. And somewhere in the stillness between their meetings, Emily began to dream. Not of doctors or devices, not of cures promised in sterile clinics, but of music, of feeling it so deeply that one day perhaps she might cross the threshold between silence and sound. A wild hope sparked in her chest, a flame fanned by the boy with the rusty violin. Richard noticed the change in his daughter before he discovered the truth. Emily moved with a restlessness he hadn't seen before, her eyes glowing with a secret she refused to share. She slipped away more often, her sketches filled with images of violins and nameless faces. Richard's instincts, honed in boardrooms and battles of power, told him something was happening beyond his control. That thought terrified him. One afternoon, a driver reported seeing Emily near the city square. Richard's fury ignited. He stormed into her room, his lips forming sharp words as he demanded an explanation. Emily tried to look away, but her trembling fingers betrayed her. She couldn't hide the notebook covered with drawings of the boy and his violin. Richard snatched it, his face darkening with every page he turned. "You will not go back there," his mouth shaped, his hands rigid with command. Emily's chest tightened. She signed back desperately, "He is not dangerous. He is my friend." But Richard's expression hardened into stone. To him, the boy was a threat, not only to Emily's safety, but to the fragile order he had built to shield her from pain. His fear disguised itself as authority. For the first time, Emily resisted him openly. She signed faster, her movements sharp with defiance, her eyes blazing with silent tears. Richard raised his hands in frustration, unable to bridge the gulf between his love and her longing. His voice rose, but Emily could not hear it, only saw the anger spilling from his lips. In that moment, she felt more isolated than ever before. When he left, the slam of the door sent vibrations through the floorboards. Emily pressed her palms to them, feeling the echo fade. It was a cruel reminder. Even in anger, her father lived in a world of sound she could not touch. She curled into herself, clutching the memory of Daniel's music, holding it like a fragile ember against the cold of her father's walls. Richard, alone in his study, poured himself a drink with hands that trembled more than he cared to admit. He told himself he was right, that a beggar boy with a violin could only bring shame, danger, and disappointment. Yet beneath his fury was fear, the fear of losing Emily to a world he couldn't control, the fear that love wasn't enough to keep her safe. His heart ached, though he buried it beneath pride. Emily spent the night staring at the ceiling, her notebook pressed to her chest. The silence in her room was unbearable after days filled with Daniel's music. She replayed his face in her mind, the way he leaned into every note as if pouring himself into it. Her father's prohibition rang louder than words ever could, but so did her longing. She knew she couldn't obey. The next morning, the mansion felt like a prison. Guards at the gates, staff watching her too closely, doors that seemed heavier than usual. Richard's will sealed every path of escape. But Emily's spirit had already tasted freedom, and she would not surrender it. She began to plan, every glance at the window a promise to herself. She would find her way back to Daniel. In the square, Daniel waited, unaware of the storm unfolding in Emily's home. Each evening he played, searching the crowd for her face. When she didn't appear, his heart sank, though he told himself she had simply been busy. Still, the music lost. Some of its fire, softening into a mournful whisper that mirrored the ache in his chest. Without knowing why, he felt abandoned. But fate was not finished weaving its threads. Emily's defiance had been born, and once born, it could not be undone. Her father's prohibition had only deepened her resolve. The bond between her and the boy with the violin was stronger than wealth, fear, or silence. And soon, Emily would choose rebellion over obedience. Daniel's days blurred together, each one measured by hunger and the scrape of his bow. Coins in his case barely bought bread, and the cold autumn winds gnawed at his thin clothes. Yet still he played, because music was the only thread tying him to hope. Without it, he feared he would disappear, swallowed by the indifference of the city. Each note was a reminder, I exist. One evening, as the sun sank behind the skyline, disaster struck. Song, one of the violin strings snapped with a sharp twang. The sound jolted Daniel like a wound. He stared at the instrument in horror, clutching it tightly. Without money, replacing the string was impossible. For the first time, the silence after the break felt heavier than anything he had endured. He remembered his mother's words then, her voice soft but firm. Your music can heal, Daniel. Even if the world doesn't hear it, it matters. He refused to surrender. Digging through scraps, he found a piece of wire from the abandoned station and threaded it through the violin. The makeshift repair was crude, but when he drew the bow, the instrument groaned and sang again. Broken, yes, but alive, like him. That night, rain began to fall, scattering people from the square. Daniel stood alone beneath a flickering streetlight, bowing across his patched strings. The drops pattered on his shoulders, dripping from his hair, but he did not stop. He poured hunger, loneliness, and stubborn hope into every note, letting the storm carry his music through the empty streets. It was not performance. It was survival. Far away, Emily pressed her forehead to her window, watching the rain blur the city lights. She imagined Daniel out there, violin against his chin, playing even when no one listened. The thought tightened her chest, filling her with both sorrow and awe. She longed to be there, to feel his music vibrating through the wet pavement, to share in the defiance that kept him playing. The next day, Daniel returned to the square with swollen fingers and soaked clothes. His case was nearly empty, the coins drowned by rain. Still, he lifted the violin again. The patched string rasped, but the sound carried a rawness that drew a few curious glances. People didn't know his story, didn't understand the weight of his song. But in his music, Daniel felt his mother's presence, steady and unyielding. Every time he played, he scanned the crowd for Emily. Her absence hollowed the square, making it colder, quieter. He didn't know why she no longer came, but the memory of her watching him gave him strength. Even if she never returned, he promised himself he would keep playing for her, for the one person who had ever truly felt his music. One evening, as the rain returned, Daniel's bow splintered at the edge. His hands trembled as he tried to mend it with tape, whispering to himself that it would hold. He drew it across the strings, and though the sound cracked and faltered, he pushed on. Each imperfect note was a defiance, a refusal to let silence win. The rain became his audience, the drops clapping against the pavement in rhythm. That was the night Emily saw him again. Defying her father's orders, she had slipped away into the storm, her heart pounding with every step. Through the blur of rain and lamplight, she spotted Daniel hunched over his violin, playing as though the world depended on it. Her breath caught. The sight of him, fragile yet unbroken, made her chest ache with a fierce admiration. She stood hidden at the edge of the square, trembling as the vibrations reached her through the ground. Each note seemed to call her closer, whispering her name in a language beyond sound. She pressed her hand to her heart, tears mixing with the rain. Emily knew then, no prohibition, no fear, not even silence itself could keep her from him. The next time Emily gathered courage to approach Daniel, she carried her notebook pressed tightly against her chest. Rain still slicked the streets, and the square smelled of wet stone and roasted chestnuts from a vendor's cart. Daniel was there, bowing carefully across his patched strings, his music cracked, but alive. Emily's heart pounded as she stepped closer, each footfall a rebellion against her. Father's commands. When the song ended, Daniel looked up, startled to see her standing so near. His first instinct was to glance away, shy, uncertain of why this wealthy girl sought him out. But then Emily opened her notebook with trembling fingers. On the page, in neat handwriting, were the words, "I cannot hear you, but I feel you." She held it out, her eyes searching his face for a reaction. Daniel's throat tightened. Of all the coins and words thrown at him in the square, none had ever struck as deeply as those written lines. He read them twice, then again, as if afraid the meaning might vanish. Slowly he nodded, his lips curving into the faintest smile. He lifted the violin and, without speaking, drew the bow gently across the strings. This time every note was played for her. Emily sat on the fountain's edge, eyes closed, her palms pressed against the stone. The vibrations coursed through her arms and into her chest, steady and warm like a heartbeat. She didn't need sound to know the melody was beautiful. Her tears slipped free, silent but shimmering in the lamplight. When she opened her eyes, Daniel was watching her, and in his gaze she saw understanding. She scribbled quickly, filling another page. "When you play, I am not alone." Daniel read it, his vision blurring. For years he had dreamed of someone truly hearing him, not just the noise he made, but the story within it. And here was this girl, deaf to the world, yet able to feel his music more deeply than anyone else. It was as if fate had carved her from silence just for him. Their meetings grew bolder after that. Emily returned often, sometimes bringing small gifts, an apple, a scarf she had knitted clumsily, a packet of pencils for his sketches. Daniel accepted each one with gratitude, though his pride made him shy. In return, he played pieces he had invented, melodies shaped from longing and hope. They communicated in two languages, ink on paper and sound on strings. One evening, Daniel dared to ask, "What's your name?" He spoke slowly, shaping the words with care so she could read his lips. Emily's face lit with surprise before she scribbled, "Emily." Beneath it she added, "And you?" He wrote shakily on the margin of her page, "Daniel." The sight of their names side by side made them both smile, as though something sacred had been written. But the square was not theirs alone. Strangers began to notice the strange pair, the rich girl with notebooks, the poor boy with his violin. Some whispered, others smirked, but Emily and Daniel ignored them. For those few hours, the world's rules fell away. She was not the millionaire's daughter. He was not the homeless boy. Together they were simply two souls connected by something neither could explain. Still, a shadow hung over them. Emily knew her father's anger if he discovered her disobedience. Daniel knew the fragility of their bond, how easily wealth and pride could tear it apart. But neither of them could resist returning to the square, to the fragile sanctuary where silence met song. The risk only made their time together more precious. And as the days passed, Emily began to wonder if her bond with Daniel was more than friendship. The way her pulse raced when he looked at her, the way her heart swelled when his bow touched the strings, it felt like something blooming quietly, tenderly, in the cracks of her silence. She didn't yet have a word for it, but she felt it growing stronger with every note he played. The day Richard discovered Emily in the square began like any other. He had finished a tense meeting and decided to take an unplanned walk, his mind heavy with numbers and deadlines. But as he crossed the plaza, his eyes froze on a sight that shattered his composure. There, sitting beside the fountain, was his daughter, laughing silently, notebook in hand, next to a ragged boy with a violin. For a moment, Richard couldn't move. His heart pounded with disbelief and rage, each beat louder than the last. Emily's face was alive with light, a joy he had not seen in years, and it terrified him. She looked free, too free, bound to a stranger he did not trust. As he approached, his jaw tightened, his shadow falling over them like a storm. Daniel, his bow stilled mid-note, the fragile melody breaking apart. He looked up at the tall man in the expensive suit, and instinctively his chest tightened. The man's eyes burned into him with contempt, stripping away the pride Daniel carried when he played. He lowered his violin slowly, as if bracing for a blow. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. She signed quickly, desperate, "Father, please!" But Richard didn't look at her hands. His gaze never left Daniel, his lips twisting into words that Emily read with horror, "Worthless beggar." The insult hit harder than any slap. Daniel clenched the violin against his chest, cheeks burning with shame. The crowd stirred, sensing conflict. Vendors paused, passers-by slowed, children tugged on their parents' coats to watch. Richard's voice rose, his gestures sharp and cutting. He demanded that Emily leave at once. Tears blurred her vision as she tried to sign back. "He is my friend. He gives me hope." But Richard's fury drowned out everything. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her away. Emily struggled, shaking her head violently, her notebook falling open to the ground. Daniel saw the words written there, pages filled with his name, with phrases like, "I feel you, and when you play, I am alive." His throat closed as he realized how much he meant to her. Yet he stood frozen, powerless against the force of her father's grip. "Stay away from her," Richard spat, his voice sharp enough to cut through the square. Daniel's chest ached, but he swallowed his anger. Fighting back would only make it worse for Emily. He tightened his hold on the violin, as if it were the only shield he had left. Emily reached back toward him, tears spilling, but Richard dragged her through the crowd. The case lay open, coins glinting under the light, but Daniel no longer cared. He felt hollow, emptied by the humiliation that clung to him like a second skin. The girl who had understood him was gone, taken by a man whose wealth could silence more than words. Daniel sank onto the fountain's edge, bow trembling in his hand, unable to play another note. Emily glanced back once, her eyes begging forgiveness. The image seared itself into Daniel's soul, her face streaked with tears, her lips forming his name without sound. He knew then that no command, no barrier, no anger from her father could erase what had been built between them. But for now she was gone, and the square had never felt so empty. As Richard's car pulled away, the crowd dispersed, whispers fading into the night. Daniel remained, clutching his violin like a lifeline. He had nothing, no home, no wealth, no power. But he had his music, and in Emily's eyes he had seen belief. That was enough to keep him breathing, enough to keep him waiting for the day their silence and song would meet again. Back at the mansion, Emily's world collapsed into stillness, heavier than ever before. She locked herself in her room, refusing to eat, refusing to smile. The walls seemed to close in, their silence no longer comforting but suffocating. Her father thought he had saved her from danger, but all Emily felt was the loss of the one thing that had made her feel alive. Richard tried to reason with her, pacing outside her door. His words were stern. His hands forming signs clumsy with frustration. "He is nothing. He will destroy you." But Emily would not answer. She pressed her palms to her ears as though to block even the sight of his gestures. For the first time, her silence was not a limitation. It was defiance. Days passed and Emily grew paler, her appetite fading. Doctors were summoned, checking her vitals, shaking their heads. There was nothing physically wrong, they explained. Her body was healthy, but her spirit was breaking. Richard stood helpless in his office, hearing their verdict. Wealth had bought him everything but the one thing he needed most, a cure for his daughter's grief. Meanwhile, Daniel played alone in the square, every night without fail. His melodies had changed, softer now, sorrowful, threaded with longing. The crowds passed indifferently, but Daniel wasn't playing for them. He played for the girl who had once sat by the fountain, who had written in her notebook that she felt his music. Each note was a prayer that she might somehow hear him still. The city seemed crueler without her. Coins were scarcer, insults harsher. But Daniel endured, gripping his violin as if it tethered him to life itself. He whispered her name into the strings, letting the sound carry her presence back to him. The rain no longer bothered him. Hunger no longer frightened him. What broke him was the empty space where Emily should have been. Emily, too, felt the emptiness. At night, she traced Daniel's name in her notebook, writing it over and over until the page blurred with tears. She pressed her hand to the window, imagining the vibrations of his violin somewhere out there, far away, but calling to her. Though her father tried to guard her, she knew her heart had already escaped. Richard watched his daughter fade, and fear crept into the cracks of his pride. He had always believed protection was love. That control was safety. But now he saw the truth. His fortress had become her prison. The more he tightened his grip, the more she slipped away. Alone in his study, He buried his head in his hands, whispering her name to the silence. The mansion staff whispered too, their faces lined with worry. They adored Emily, but they dared not defy Richard. Still, they left small kindnesses at her door, a favorite book, a tray with hot tea, flowers from the garden. Emily appreciated them, but none of it filled the emptiness. Only one thing could, and he was out there in the square, waiting. One evening, Emily stood before her mirror, staring into her own eyes. She saw a girl trapped between silence and song, between obedience and freedom. Her father's love weighed heavy, but Daniel's music lifted her, even from a distance. She touched the reflection, lips trembling as she mouthed words she had never spoken aloud. "I choose." The choice had not yet been acted upon, but it had already been made. Emily could not remain in this house of silence forever. Somewhere beyond the gates, her destiny played on a rusty violin, calling her back. And soon, no fear, no prohibition, not even love, twisted into control, would be able to keep her from answering. The rain had ceased, leaving the city washed clean and glistening under the glow of street lamps. Emily slipped from the mansion in silence, her heart hammering as she ran barefoot through the empty streets. The night air was cold, but she hardly noticed. Every step carried her closer to the square, to the boy who had awakened something inside her that her father could never understand. When she arrived, Daniel was there, just as she had imagined. Exhaustion weighed on his frame, his clothes damp from days of rain, but his bow still moved across the violin with stubborn devotion. The patched string rasped, the tone uneven, yet the music breathed with life. His head was bowed, eyes half closed, as if he were playing to hold himself together. Emily stopped at the edge of the square, breathless. The fountain gurgled behind her, pigeons shifted in the shadows, and somewhere a distant church bell tolled. But none of it mattered. Her entire world narrowed to the trembling notes spilling from Daniel's violin. Something stirred inside her, different from every vibration she had felt before. It was sharper, brighter, closer to sound. She stepped forward, her hands shaking. The music grew stronger, as though reaching for her. Each note crawled beneath her skin, climbed into her ribs and pressed against her heart. Then suddenly, it happened. The sound broke through. It was faint, distorted, but real. A gasp escaped her lips as tears blurred her vision. She was hearing, truly hearing, for the very first time. Daniel's bow faltered when he saw her collapse to her knees, hands pressed to her ears in shock. He dropped his violin, rushing forward, panic flashing across his face. But Emily wasn't in pain. She was laughing, sobbing, clutching at the air as if trying to catch every note before it disappeared. "I can hear," she whispered hoarsely, the words strange and new on her tongue. The world seemed to pause. The fountain's splash rang in her ears, the rustle of pigeons startled her, and the distant traffic hummed like a living pulse. Everything was overwhelming, a storm of sound crashing against a soul that had known only silence. She wept openly, clutching Daniel's arm as though he were the anchor holding her steady in the chaos. Daniel stared at her, stunned. He had dreamed of someone truly hearing him, but this was beyond imagining. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Your music can heal." He trembled as he realized they had come true. It wasn't science, wasn't chance. It was a miracle born from strings, hope, and a bond stronger than silence. Emily lifted her face toward him, lips trembling into a smile. "Your music," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can hear it." The words were fragile, uneven, but filled with wonder. Daniel felt his own tears spill as he picked up the violin again. With shaking hands, he drew the bow once more, and this time Emily's laughter rang out with every note. The crowd began to gather, drawn by the spectacle of the girl who cried and laughed as though the world had just been born. Strangers covered their mouths. whispering, pointing, unsure if what they saw was real. Emily didn't care. She clung to the miracle, to the boy who had given her what doctors and fortune never could. For the first time, her silence had shattered, and in that square, beneath the lamplight and the trembling strings, Emily's life was forever divided, before the violin and after. The night of the miracle had begun, and neither she, Daniel, nor the world around them would ever be the same. The words burst from Emily's lips before she could stop them. "I can hear!" Her voice, broken and trembling, carried through the square like a trumpet blast. For her, it was the first time sound had ever been born from her own throat, and the astonishment in her eyes silenced the night itself. People froze, turning toward her as though a miracle had just unfolded in their midst. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some pressed hands to their mouths. Others whispered furiously, and a few simply wept at the sight of the girl who seemed to have been reborn. The air vibrated with awe, disbelief, and reverence. Emily stood, swaying on weak legs, her tears streaming freely as she clutched Daniel's arm. "I can hear you," she whispered again, as if afraid the gift would vanish. Daniel dropped to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. His violin slipped to the ground, forgotten, as he pressed his hands to his face. His music, once ignored and dismissed, had just changed a life. He couldn't explain it, didn't dare try, but he knew the truth in his heart. His mother had been right. His music had healed. It was then that Richard appeared, drawn by the commotion. He pushed through the gathering crowd, his sharp suit cutting a path among whispers and stares. His eyes landed on Emily, her face radiant with joy, and for a moment he faltered. The sight of his daughter laughing and crying, sound finally filling her world, tore the breath from his lungs. Emily saw him and ran forward, her voice cracking but clear. "Father, I can hear." The words fell heavy on Richard's ears, not because of their volume, but because of their impossibility. He staggered, disbelief painted across his face. For years he had begged doctors for this very miracle, and yet here it was, born not of wealth or medicine, but of a homeless boy's violin. The square seemed to hold its breath. Richard looked from his daughter to Daniel, who stood trembling, his eyes lowered in humility. For the first time, Richard had no words. He could neither deny nor accept what stood before him. Pride, confusion, fear, and awe battled within him, but beneath it all lay something deeper. Gratitude he didn't know how to express. Emily didn't wait for his response. She turned back to Daniel, gripping his hands. "Play," she begged softly, her voice uneven but growing stronger. "Please play again." Daniel, with shaking fingers, lifted the violin and set the bow against the strings. When he drew the first note, Emily gasped, clutching her ears as laughter bubbled from her lips. The crowd cheered, swept into the miracle. Tears welled in Richard's eyes as he watched his daughter dance to the sound she had never known. Each giggle, each cry, each clumsy word struck him harder than any business failure or financial loss ever had. His empire had not done this. His power had not done this. A boy with nothing had given his daughter the world. Phones flashed, capturing the moment as the miracle spread beyond the square. But for Emily and Daniel, there was no one else. She leaned close, listening with both her ears and her heart, and he played as though every string carried his soul into her. Around them, the city was no longer indifferent. It was alive with wonder. And so the square transformed into holy ground, a place where silence broke and sound bloomed. Emily's voice had shaken the air for the first time, and the world would never be able to forget it. But as miraculous as the night had been, questions loomed like shadows. How could this be explained? Would it last? And could love born of such wonder survive the trials still to come? In the days that followed, Emily became the center of a storm. Doctors filled Richard's mansion, carrying machines, charts, and endless theories. They pressed cold instruments to her ears, whispered behind clipboards, and ran tests late into the night. Yet despite their efforts, no explanation could be found. Her hearing had returned, yes, but how, no one could say. Some doctors spoke of sudden neurological awakenings, others of rare miracles where dormant senses reignited, but none could explain why it had happened at that exact moment, with that exact boy, and that rusty violin. Science does not have an answer, one confessed reluctantly. Richard's frustration boiled. He had paid for cures his whole life, and now the cure had come freely from a source he least expected. Emily, however, didn't care about their confusion. She spent every waking hour listening, to the wind rushing past her window, to the footsteps echoing down hallways, to the birds that sang outside the garden. Each sound was a gift, dazzling and overwhelming, and most precious of all was Daniel's violin. When he played, she closed her eyes, letting every note stitch itself into her heart. Richard watched his daughter with a mixture of awe and unease. He could not deny the miracle, yet he could not accept its source. Pride gnawed at him, gratitude softened him. The two forces warred until his face became a battlefield of emotions. To admit that a homeless boy had done what wealth could not was almost unbearable, but so was the sight of Emily's joy. Meanwhile, whispers spread beyond the mansion walls. Neighbors, reporters, and strangers all spoke of the girl who heard music for the first time. Some called it divine intervention, others mocked it as fantasy. The square where it happened became a place of quiet reverence, as though the stones themselves had absorbed the miracle. Daniel, however, avoided the attention, slipping into shadows whenever he could. For Daniel, the miracle was both a blessing and a burden. He was proud, humbled, to have given Emily what no one else could. But with every new crowd that gathered, he felt smaller, as if the world would soon crush him under its expectations. He didn't seek fame, only the quiet truth that Emily could now hear him, truly hear him. That alone was enough. Emily refused to leave his side. She begged her father to let Daniel visit the mansion, to let him play where she could listen for hours. Richard resisted at first, his pride erecting barriers, but the more he watched his daughter laugh, sing clumsy notes, and glow with newfound joy, the weaker his defenses became. At last, he allowed Daniel to step inside. The moment was awkward. Daniel, in his worn jacket and patched shoes, stood among marble floors and chandeliers, out of place but unbowed. Emily greeted him with arms outstretched, her laughter echoing in the grand halls. For Richard, the sight was both humbling and painful. His empire of wealth had never made his daughter this happy. A boy with nothing had accomplished everything. Doctors continued their tests, but Emily ignored them, running to Daniel whenever he lifted his bow. She followed the rise and fall of every note, her laughter brightening each corner of the mansion. The staff, once stiff with formality, softened at the sight. Even they knew the true healing had not come from machines, but from music born of a boy's heart. And as Richard stood in the doorway one evening, watching Daniel play and Emily laugh, he felt something shift inside him. Perhaps it was humility, perhaps grace, perhaps both. For the first time, he considered what he had never dared before, that love and miracles could arrive from places beyond his control, and soon he would have to decide whether to embrace it or resist until the very end. The mansion no longer echoed with silence. Laughter, uneven and shy at first, now filled its halls. Emily practiced speaking, stumbling over words but delighting in every sound. Sometimes her voice cracked, sometimes it wavered, but each syllable was music to her own ears. And always, Daniel's violin guided her, steady and patient, weaving his melodies with her fragile phrases. Richard watched from the doorway, his heart torn open by what he saw. For years, he had poured wealth into treatments, believing love meant control and protection. Yet this boy, ragged, hungry, forgotten by society, had achieved what millions could not. Pride melted into humility, and humility into gratitude. At last, Richard stepped forward and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You are welcome here," he mouthed slowly. Daniel stiffened, unsure if he could trust the gesture, but Emily's shining face urged him to believe. He nodded, gripping his violin tighter, as if it were the bridge between two worlds now joined. In that moment, the millionaire and the beggar ceased to be enemies. They were bound by the miracle that had transformed Emily's life and, unknowingly, theirs as well. Days became weeks, and the bond between Emily and Daniel deepened. They spoke in words, signs, music and silence, weaving languages together like threads in a tapestry. She taught him to read a little. He taught her to listen, not just with ears, but with heart. They were equals, two souls who had saved each other in ways neither could have imagined. The city, curious and skeptical, eventually grew quiet about the miracle. Reporters moved on, crowds faded, and the square returned to its usual rhythm. Yet for Emily and Daniel, that fountain remained sacred ground. Whenever they returned, she sat where she had first felt his music, and he played as if the world had been born again. Together, they remembered the night everything changed. Richard softened, though his journey was not without struggle. Pride still tugged at him, but love tugged harder. He began to see Daniel not as a threat, but as the answer to prayers he hadn't admitted to making. He offered Daniel education, shelter, and dignity, not as charity, but as recognition of what he had already given. For the first time, Richard learned what it meant to let go of control. Emily blossomed. She spoke more each day, her voice growing steadier, her laughter louder. She marveled at the sounds of birds, rain, and even her own. Footsteps on gravel, but nothing compared to Daniel's violin. Every note reminded her of the miracle that had opened her world. She often whispered to him, voice trembling but certain, "Your music saved me." Daniel, too, was transformed. No longer just the boy in the square, he became Emily's companion, her anchor, and her teacher in resilience. Though wealth surrounded him, he remained humble, never forgetting the nights when rain was his only audience. He played not for fame, but for love, for the girl who had felt his music before she ever heard it. Together, they stood as living proof that miracles are not always found in laboratories or hospitals. Sometimes they are hidden in the most fragile places, in broken strings, in notebooks filled with trembling words, in the meeting of two lonely souls. Their story spread quietly, not through headlines, but through whispers of hope, that love and music could heal what seemed unhealable. And so Emily's final words to those who listened became a lesson, spoken with clarity and strength. Never underestimate the sound of a heart that refuses to be silenced. Her voice, once a dream, now carried through the air like music itself. Beside her, Daniel's bow rose and fell, and together they played the melody of a new beginning. And so, Emily's life was forever changed, not by doctors, sound of a rusty violin, but by in the hands of a boy who had nothing to give but his heart. She discovered a world she had only dreamed of, and Daniel found the one person who truly heard him. Together, they proved that miracles can bloom where no one expects them, and that sometimes the greatest wealth is hidden in love, courage, and hope. But now I want to hear from you. If you had lived your whole life in silence, what's the very first sound you would want to hear? Tell me in the comments. I'll be reading your stories. And if this story touched you, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that miracles are real. Because sometimes all it takes is one note, one connection, one act of faith to change everything.